And my left hand started to go numb. These three fingers here started to go numb. I'm 18. What do I know? So I asked my teacher. He said, well, I don't know. I asked another teacher. They said, I don't know. I went to the Musicians Clinic at Mass General Hospital, which is supposed to be the best hospital in the region. And they watched me play and they said nothing. There was one day when I was in Finland, I was standing in my little tiny kitchen. I lived in one room. All of a sudden, I could feel the floor. For the first time that I could remember, I could feel my feet grounded on the floor. And it's those moments, that you don't know when it's going to happen, but you'll have little things like that that'll sort of crystallize. Oh, something's happening. Celebrate every little tiny bit of progress. We often get discouraged because we're not moving fast enough. We know what we want, and it's so big what we want, and we're not getting there. And so we have to build in that. Like, even if we make one little tiny step forward, celebrate it. Get that joy in your body because you need it. He said, you just never know the impact you're having on a young person through being a music teacher. Every word we say or look that we give, the way we encourage or challenge, the environment we create and the support we give, it's such a humbling position. Every single moment counts. And that's why I say teaching is sacred.
All right, welcome back to the show, everybody. I am very, very excited to introduce our guest today. When I first announced that I was going to be doing this show, my aunt, Nicole Elkins, who is a very accomplished flautist herself, or flutist, she immediately texted me and asked me to reach out to this person because of her work in the flute area, especially in the world of body mapping. She has written a book on body mapping called Body Mapping for Flutists, what every flute teacher needs to know about the body. And she is one of the leading authorities on that subject. She also has a program and a business called Music Minus Pain, and has a teacher education program for private instructors called the Transformational Teacher Program. So I'm really excited for what we're going to get into today. And without further ado, Dr. Lea Pearson, welcome to the show.
Hi, Clark. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really pleased to be here.
It's just going to be such a fun time. When I was listening to a couple of interviews you have also done with other flutists, I was really excited about the stuff you guys were covering over there because it's right down my alley, even as a trumpet player. Some of these principles are just universal musician principles for health, right?
Right.
So what I like to do right at the beginning of the interviews is just have people share their experience with injury. And I know you had quite an extensive experience with injury for quite a while. And so if you want to just share that experience.
So what happened to me is what happens to a lot of people when they get to college. They start practicing like mad, or sometimes when they get to an intensive summer program. It happens around jury time and around recital time that you start really working hard. And not only are you using your body hard, but there's usually a little bit of stress that goes along with it, right? For recital or juries or whatever. And my left hand started to go numb. These three fingers here started to go numb. I'm 18. What do I know? So I asked my teacher. He said, well, I don't know. I asked another teacher. They said, I don't know. I went to the Musicianship Clinic at Mass General Hospital, which is supposed to be the best hospital in the region, where I, by the way, just had knee surgery. And they watched me play and they said nothing. And I know now, looking back, I know exactly what was going on. But that was really the beginning of a 30-year journey of pain for me. Oh, my goodness. It started just with that, and there were certain things that made that worse. But the thing was, I didn't want to stop playing. I was playing in 2 orchestras. I was doing chamber music. I was doing, new music with composers and recitals and all that. We didn't even have music at my school, but I went to other schools to do that. Mm. And I thought, well, the only thing I can do is practice less. So I'll just practice less, which of course is not really helpful in terms of getting better as a musician. But it was the only thing I knew how to do. So that went on for quite a while. I took a little bit of time off and did some other jobs. And then I just decided I really miss being a musician. I want to be a musician. So I went back to get my master's at Stanford, studied with Frances Blaisdell, who was a fantastic pedagogue. I learned so much about teaching from her. But she had me locked in a practice room for, as long as I could, playing nothing but Taffanel and Gobert for the first semester, the first quarter, actually, because I had never worked on technique. Nobody never made me do that. And that started making things worse. And, the whole time I was there, the 2 years I was working on my master's, I couldn't figure out what would help me. I started thinking about Alexander technique, but I didn't have access to a teacher. And then, excuse me, I met my husband there. We got married and moved to the Midwest for college teaching jobs. And at that point, I got an orchestra job playing in the South Bend Symphony. I was doing a lot of the usual freeway musician stuff, commuting, teaching at 3 different colleges, playing in 4 different orchestras. It's just all over the place. And that's when it really started to get bad. And I would just sit there and look at my flute and cry. I couldn't even take it out of the case. I would just sit there and cry because not only did it hurt physically so much, but the emotional pain of not being able to do what I really wanted to do was devastating. As you well know, it's a whole identity crisis. So there were a couple of times where I stopped playing and, it got a little better. And of course, every time I went back to playing, it got worse. This went on for a long time. We finally moved to Kentucky, where I couldn't really play much. There wasn't really work for me there. And at that point, I said, look, I got to either figure this out or quit. I've got to learn how to do this because it's too awful. And I had known, I had done some workshops with a Finnish teacher up in Maine. She had married a guy from Maine, so she came to Maine every summer to do workshops, Lisa Ruoho, and then Barbara Carnival, who was well known as an Alexander technique teacher who specialized in working with musicians. And I said, I could go get a doctorate. If I can get into Ohio State, I could study with Barbara Carnival, who lives in Columbus. She wasn't affiliated with this school, but I could take lessons with her. So that's exactly what I did. I enrolled at Ohio State. I had a TA with Catherine Borst-Jones, and I spent all my school loan money on lessons with Barbara Carnival, and that saved my life. Literally, every week for 3 years, I went to her house, and she worked with me on the floor. She, as an Alexander teacher, of course, she used hands-on, but we talked about all aspects of life. I had 2 little kids at the time, and she helped me figure out how to manage that. I was in school, I was teaching, was raising these little kids. Part of the time, my husband was gone for a year. It was just total chaos. But through that period of time, it took me 3 years to undo all the crap that I'd learned. So that was the beginning of positive future.
Well, yeah, and it's just that I was thinking when you were telling that story, the importance of mentors. It seems like every person I've interviewed thus far, with the exception of maybe 2, have one of the first things they mention is I went to see this person or I went to see someone, right? Because sometimes, unfortunately, private teachers, as well-meaning as they are and as well-educated as they are, that's starting to change, but usually they aren't as well in the know about the injuries, right? And so we have to go to these outside sources, right? Or whoever, whoever it is. If it is your private teacher, that's great. But you need that mentor to get
absolutely
to where you need to go.
And because you don't know what you don't know. And when we get injured, we are so focused on that injury. That's all we can see. It's like we got blinders on, and we don't see often the context in which it developed, and the context in which it's getting worse, and the context in which we can heal. And it's a very broad context. It's not at all about just dealing with my shoulder or whatever. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of emotional and mental issues to deal with, not to mention physical. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And to kind of stay on those emotional and mental things, what we were talking about off camera was the importance of staying healthy musically during the recovery period, right? And so if you want to just go into like what types of things, if there were any that really helped you just kind of get through that time musically, whether, some people, make it a point to go to more concerts or listen to more music or whatever. But what was your experience with that?
That's such an interesting question, and it has so many facets to it. I think the first thing is about identity. It's the piece about identity, to own the fact that I am an artist. Even if I can't play the way I want to play, I am an artist. When I started my doctorate, I was 45 years old, and I'd been through a lot. I'd played tons of orchestral repertoire, tons of chamber music and solo repertoire. When we would be in music history classes, I'd know a lot of the people who wrote the articles in the journals, because they'd been teachers of mine. I brought so much to it, and to realize that being an artist is not dependent on how many notes you can play or whether you can play the way you want. It's your heart and your soul. So that I think is the first thing. We tend to, when we get injured, we tend to limit our concept of ourselves. And we're so depressed and anxious that we lose that sort of the ebullience of, I have something to say, something really important. So I got depressed. Yeah, I think those years in Kentucky, I first realized, wow, when I found myself crying all the time while I was driving, I said, I better go see somebody about this. So I had to deal with all of those mental health issues, but I don't separate musical health from the rest of my being. Music is there. It's within me. And I love to listen to music. I can sing it. My husband was a musician at the time also. So I was always surrounded by music. All of my sisters and my parents were musicians. My cousins were musicians. It was just music everywhere. But this is hard to articulate, but I'm going to try. The thoughts that we have and the emotions that we have such an influence on how we think about music. So we have a performance, even if it's not the hardest thing in the world, but we know we can manage it. Oh God, what am I going to do? Is it going to come out all right? What are people going to think? All that crap that we go through, right? And this is what I focus on. That affects how we use our bodies. So all of those difficult thoughts create tension in the body, and you cannot separate. This is what we learned from COVID. You cannot separate mental and physical health. And then the emotions, I'm feeling depressed, or I'm worried about this, or, I'm anxious. Sometimes we can't even identify what our feelings are, but they're there, and they all have a somatic component. So somatic means connected to the body. Everything we think and feel and do has a somatic element to it. So you can't just put the body over here and say, well, now I'm going to address my thoughts. It's all connected. I learned this through body mapping and Alexander technique, and also through therapy too. When I was in therapy off and on for a long time, it's like I got to the point where I was like, okay, enough talking already. I need to deal with how this feels in my body. I can't just, I'm not an abstract thinker. I don't think abstractly. I'm very practical and kinesthetic.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question at all?
It does. Yeah. No one's ever answered it that way. That's really, really deep. I love it. It's, everything's connected, you know?
Yeah.
I view music as a spiritual experience as well.
Absolutely.
And that absolutely affects your physiology, you know? And, I guess that even more drives home the importance that you got to keep a holistic health approach to your life, right?
Yeah.
Physical, mental.
We have transcendent experiences. We have incredibly joyful experiences. I'll never, and when I was in high school, I got to play the Brahms Haydn variations, and there's this gorgeous flute solo that comes in. Still one of the most beautiful things I've ever heard. And to be able to play some music like that is just like, that's what keeps us coming back. And that's why we don't quit if we don't have to.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And then something else you were talking about that just jogged a quote in my memory with just that whole concept of how music is just connected to the rest of us. There was an interview I've watched multiple times, of the great Wynton Marsalis, trumpet player, talking about Louis Armstrong. And he was talking about how some people view technique and the, I guess, virtuosity of technique as how many notes you can play and that type of flashiness of musicianship. But then he says, but the highest degree of technique is nuance, right? And being able to really convey the message that I'm ad-libbing what he said, but like being able to convey the message of what you're trying to say, you know?
Right.
And that's just, I feel like it goes along with that mental, like how we view our musicianship, how we view our relationship between musicianship and our bodies even. It's all nuanced, right? It's a whole nuanced experience.
I haven't thought about that. Creating music has some of the most subtle movement that exists on the planet, except for maybe some dancers. But when you think about the kinds of muscle movement your embouchure has to do, or what it takes to bend a pitch, a quarter tone, it's tiny, tiny distinctions we make in sound and in movement that are so subtle. And yet we're not trained to think of our bodies as being capable of subtle movement. We say, well, you hold the flute this way and you do your fingers that way, and this is how you do it right. Without thinking about the fact that while the instruments are primarily the same, every single body is different. Nobody has the same length fingers. Everybody has different thumbs. It's not as much of an issue on the trumpet, but everybody has different length arms. So to say to people, well, there's only one way you should do it, and that's the right way, it sets people up for failure. I actually have a student who thinks that there's something wrong with their body because they can't hold the instrument the way they want to. Think about that. What is that? What are we saying to students? Yeah. So my job in working with this person is to help figure out, well, how are we going to do it? If you can make a flute for a one-handed person, we can figure this out. Yeah, there is.
I'd like to see that.
Yeah,
that's awesome.
It's phenomenal.
Well, and that's the thing that actually kept me in the game as a trumpet player a year and a half ago, when I realized that, oh dang, there's everybody's different. The blanket statements that we tend to use in pedagogy across the board, no matter what instrument, may not work for every student because of their physiology, because of their makeup. For trumpet, it's like their jaw structure or the size of their lips or anything, and I'm sure you were just talking about some of the instrument specific things for flute, right?
Yep.
And so going back to your time of getting through that injury, how did that dealing with body mapping and the mental aspect of recovery. How did that affect your teaching going forward? Or were you teaching back then?
Oh, yeah. I've been teaching since I was 20. So always teaching. Profoundly affected my teaching. I went to the first, so my Finnish teacher's name was Lea Pearson, and I did end up getting a Fulbright to go study with her in Helsinki at the Sibelius Academy as part of my doctorate. So one of the reasons I went back to school is that I have a better chance of getting a Fulbright. But the very first master class I did with her in the summer blew my mind. And I went back, I was teaching, high school, after school stuff. And the first thing I did was back up so that I could look at the whole student. Because I had other teachers who would, with Frances Blaisdell, she would have 2 music stands. She would stand right next to me, and she had her own copy of the music, and she would write stuff on my music and write down notes, so I'm just there sort of trying to take it all in. But when I stood across the room, I could watch the student's whole body, and I could see, what are they doing with their head and their shoulders? I could see how are they using their legs? How are they connected to the ground? What's happening with their fingers? And that was just the beginning of that sort of holistic perspective. And I didn't know beads then, but it changed everything for me. And I've grown from there. And so now what I'm really passionate about is helping people learn how to teach in this way, because we have to look at the whole person. We have to. So going back a little bit to something that you said earlier about all the different, body shapes and stuff. It's a fundamental flaw in music teaching, in the conservatory model, that you have to do it in a certain way. And what we need as musicians is we need to put the student at the center of what is teaching. What does that student need? How does their body work? What are they thinking? What are they feeling? What are they bringing to the situation? What do they want? Instead of them just coming into a lesson and standing there like an empty vessel and the teacher pouring all of this information into them without even asking one question about what they think. If you had lessons, you probably had lessons like that. You just go and you're like, tell me, because you pay money and this might be a great teacher, whatever. And what we really need is to cultivate the own students' artistry and artistic expression and find out what they're thinking and what they're feeling. What do they know and what do they want?
Oh,
How do you want to play this piece?
Yeah. I'm so glad you went to that. I was planning on getting there eventually, but let's do it right now. One of the hardest things for me personally, and I'm sure I'm not the only one in the world of musician injury, is especially with musicians who have injured themselves through overuse or through poor technique or whatever, is regaining that trust in yourself to be your best teacher. Because in at least for me, to kind of open up a little bit, the hardest part about that was I kind of got myself into this mess in some ways, right? Through over practicing in my case and things like that.
Right.
And so regaining that trust, how you as an educator, have you helped students to regain that trust in themselves as their number one teacher, and then you being the facilitator to help that?
Well, that's such a great question. The first thing I tell people is that it's not your fault. It is not your fault that you hurt. This is, and I go systemic. This is a system-wide problem. It's a problem with our educational system that we've inherited this model from 150 years ago, which was designed for a certain thing, to build up the orchestras in Europe. Paris Conservatory spread out to all around Europe and this country and the Far East. And it's not your teacher's fault either, because they were taught this way, and we even, when we have teachers who are abusive or super critical, most of those people had that happen to them. So it's this kind of, it's similar to intergenerational trauma that we have. It's been passed down, this what I call toxic self-judgment. We get that from the very beginning. So what do you do if you're 10 years old and you come in and you start taking trumpet lessons and your teacher tells you all the things that you're doing wrong.
Those are the things you focus on.
What does that tell you about yourself?
That there's really just you're focusing on the negative. You're not seeing the positive.
So you think there's something wrong with me.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't start when you're in college. It starts in the very first lesson, I think. And I can see now that happened to me as well. And it's almost every musician that I've worked with who has been injured has an element of that state. I'm going to call it a state because it's a state of being. When you believe there's something wrong with me, I can never be good enough. I'm never going to get it the way I want, no matter what I do. My teacher is always going to be correcting me. It's a culture of correction and criticism. And I know I'm being a little intense about this, but it's because I see so many. I've worked with over 1,000 injured musicians in the past 25 years, directly, and of course, indirectly through a lot more people, but that's a lot of pain. And I see it directly related to how we think about ourselves and how we've been taught unintentionally to think about ourselves. It's not something that people are doing on purpose. I'm going to make my student be really self-critical. No, it's part of the system. And so then we get there, and then our teachers kind of reinforce that instead of and a lot of musicians will say this, my goal as a teacher is to make myself obsolete. And like parents, that's your goal as a parent, to make yourself obsolete. So you give somebody the tools they need to go forward. But we don't always stop to think about what those tools are, what they really need, the kind of thoughtfulness and and most specifically, body awareness. We can teach them how to do phrasing, and we can teach them history and theory and, all this intellectual stuff that they need to know. But we really need to teach them how to use their body. So when they get to a difficult gig, or they're at a gig and the person next to them sort of sneers at them and looks funny at them because they made a mistake or whatever, how do they deal with that? I worked with somebody in their 80s who was traumatized. They had had other trauma earlier in their life, but they played in an orchestra next to a musician who was constantly criticizing them. And they got to the point where they couldn't play anymore. They were so traumatized by this person, always dumping on them. So this is stuff we really need to help our students have these tools. I spent a lot of time teaching tools of, I'm not going to call it relaxation, but really what it's about is being present. Because if you become fully present in all your senses, you're going to lose those nasty little negative thoughts because there's no room for them.
It really isn't. That's been something that I've also tried to focus on in the last year and a half. And I think for everybody out there who's going through injury recovery, that is probably one of the greatest things you can work on off the horn in my case, or off the flute in yours, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good answer to your.
Yeah, exactly. Because once you are able to, whenever that happens, to begin playing again, you'll be bringing a whole new perspective to your instrument, right? And it'll just totally enrich your experience.
And isn't that what we want in performance? We want to be fully present. We don't want to be worrying about what the audience is thinking or what we have for dinner or any of that stuff. We want to be fully there, present, so we can communicate with the audience and say what we want to say. And that takes all of your senses, noticing the space around you, noticing what you feel, what the air feels like, what connecting with actually eye contact with the audience and communicating with them. A lot of people don't do that. Mm-hmm. They're like put a wall up. But that's really what we want. I was just working with somebody yesterday who was in school and very stressed and all this stuff going on. And they said, I don't know how to get out of this. And so I said, this is a question I'll ask often. Where is the place where you feel the most calm and peaceful? You're just so happy when you're there and you're just, like this. And they said, The beach. So I said, well, let's go to the beach. I actually learned this from an African drummer I used to teach in an after-school program where all the kids would come running out at 3:00 and there's a madhouse, and this drummer would take her drumming class and she would take them to the beach. Half these kids had never been to a beach, but we went there. What do you smell? What do you see? What's the sound of the waves or the wind or the birds? What does your skin feel like? Can you feel the temperature of the air? So this is what a lot of people would call visualization. I think it's a lot more than visualizing. It's really what I call kinestheticizing. It's feeling it in your body and all your senses. And this person became very calm. And I said, do you ever feel like that when you're playing? Oh God, no.
Back in the
there's a tool in 2 minutes, and I can do it in one. In 2 minutes, they went from, I have all this worry, I don't know what to do about it, to that's how fast we can make those changes if we learn how to do it.
Yep. Everybody
we should be teaching that.
Yeah. Hopefully y'all wrote that down, because that's money right there. And the next thing I wanted to talk about was along that line of that culture shift that needs to happen with the education system, because I've just observed in my peers at my school and in myself, definitely in myself, that kind of, it's interesting you use the conservatory mindset, because that's the kind of how I perceive it,
Yeah. It's a model. It's actually been identified in research, the conservatory model. Yeah.
Oh, I'd be interested to check that out. What would be needed, like, I guess, concrete things, as well as cultural things that would need to be able to shift that to a more present-minded, healthy mindset, around playing?
That's great. We have to recognize that we're in a really difficult time. That if you, think about what youth are going through. Everybody who's in college now has been in school shooting situations since they were in kindergarten. So a colleague of mine said this to me, and I was like, oh my God. School has never been a safe place. What are we doing to kids when they spend all day, every day in a place that is not safe, where they have to worry about barricading themselves? This is trauma with a capital T. This isn't just little t trauma. This is big trauma. And many have actually, been through actual shooting. So we've got that. We've got climate mess going on, where kids are thinking, geez, the earth might not even be here for me. Why should I bother? Because there's nothing, it's all going to be destroyed. We've got economic insecurity. We've got political divisions, massive amounts of hate, people going back and forth. We've got kids, especially in the music business, in the music world, we have a lot of kids from the GLBTQ population who are sensitive to this stuff going on. They deal with discrimination, with hate. Maybe in the music classroom they're safe, but there are a lot of places where they're not safe. We've got folks of color, brown and black folks, and especially, oh my God, it's the worst. The high suicide rates are for trans kids of color. It's up to last figure I saw was 60% of suicide ideation. We are messed up. And these kids have a ton of anxiety. So, I'm talking about studio teaching here because it's a little different from classroom. In classroom, you've got more group support. But if you expect kids to come into your studio and drop their entire life at the door and just play with abandon, it's just not going to happen. I talk to university teachers, and kids are so anxious, and they come in and they cry, and they can't focus, and it's a mess. So the first thing there's three things we have to do, actually. The first thing is to acknowledge that we need to do better at student-centered teaching. Now, this is an old concept that started coming up around turn of the 20th century. Around early 1900, Alexander, Jacques Delcros, Maria Montessori, all these great educators, Karl Orff, Kodai, they had this what was revolutionary at the time, this belief that you have to start where kids are and bring what you're teaching to them. So I learned about the first Dalcroze class I ever took. It blew my mind because they said, well, just walk at your own speed. And the teacher made music to go with the speed that the child was walking, their own speed. They didn't say, I'm going to play this march and you walk in time to my march. They said, you go ahead and walk and I'll make music for you.
Huh.
Think
That's
about
fascinating.
how different that is from trying to make the child adapt to something versus celebrating and reinforcing what they're doing. So the first thing is to learn more about student-centered teaching. And there's a ton of stuff out there. I've written a couple articles about it. The second is we need to celebrate what people are doing. If you look into positive psychology and all the negative thought, we already talked about negative thoughts, where 80% of our thoughts are negative and at least half of those are the same ones over and over again. When do we celebrate in private lessons? When are we going, oh my God, that was fantastic. What did you do? I want to hear that. Tell me what you were thinking about. I remember my Alexander teacher, Barbara, when I did something right, she'd be like jumping up and down like a little kid, It was like, we have to shift that mindset so that we have joy and celebration instead of thinking about everything we do is wrong. And then two other things. So that all of that is pointing to putting music on a somatic basis, so that making music is done through movement. And that's what body mapping is all about. Every sound we make is created by movement. But the other big thing, and this is really general, and this is going into classroom work as well. We have to look at trauma-infused or trauma-sensitive instruction. And there's a lot of good research about there that what really matters, what helps kids who are in difficult situations build resilience. And there's a whole thing about adverse childhood experiences, and the newest research coming out about focal dystonia is all about how we have to do this and a bunch of other stuff, but it's basically the same stuff. One caring adult who sees a child once a week for a year or more can change that child's future and help build resilience. There's enough research out there that says it. So how do we do that? Look at who those people are. They're the music teachers. We have more time with kids than their own parents do sometimes. So when we build in collaboration and engagement and agency and self-determination and all these things that they have proven through the research of trauma-centered, trauma-infused teaching, the same things that we need to build the confidence of our kids. I think, personally, it's my personal opinion, that when we start kids off at age 10, telling them all the things they do wrong, we are building in traumatic experiences for them, small t trauma, but that's part of our system.
Yeah.
And I come at this from a long history with progressive education and studying psychology and studying trauma and my own personal experience and working with all these different musicians and realizing, oh my God, if we don't address what's happening with people and really take that holistic look, we're missing the boat. And we're not going to teach them to be self-sufficient, to be their own teachers.
Right. Oh my gosh. I got to tell you.
That's go ahead, what gets me out of bed every day.
Yeah. Same actually right now. One of my mentors who has helped me get through my injury, he's a local trumpet teacher at a local university here, and has gone through his own injury and started doing his own series of educational videos. And that was one of the things he actually brought up. And one of them was how trauma-based teaching, like he used those words. So you're the only other person I've heard talk about that other than him. But how that leads to injury. because he gave like a video on like the pedagogical reasons which lead to injury, which we'll get into in a second for flute, but the psychological reasons for injury, and he made the point that if that's not taken care of, even if the pedagogical stuff is in place, then they're still putting themselves at risk for injury later on. And it just blew my mind.
Let's talk about fear. Let's talk about fear.
Please.
How many times have you gone into a lesson worried that you're not going to play it right, or your teacher's going to say something, criticize you, right?
Yeah.
I think probably just about every lesson I ever went into, I was like anxious about it. So what happens to the being when we're in fear? What happens to your body and your brain?
It's either fight or flight.
Absolutely. The fear response. So we're in stress. So here we are expecting students to play their best, and they're already, a little bit, and they're never going to breathe well. They're never going to have good technique. They're never going to be able to do this in front of somebody where they feel intimidated. So totally. Yeah. I mean, what I say to people all the time is that we're dealing with a primitive brain here, and the brain can't distinguish between a bear in front of you and a black note, a wrong note. There's no difference. The brain is saying, you're going to die. So, it sounds ridiculous, but it's true.
It's so true. Our brain has not evolved past that autonomic nervous system response.
Well, it has, but for different purposes.
Right, exactly.
We're talking about the most primitive needs of people, and safety is the first need after food, shelter, and water. And think about COVID. I didn't feel safe for 3 years. It took a huge toll on me, as an older person, and I'm inside my one room for 3 years, not going anywhere. I didn't feel safe. And I could feel that just draining me. If kids don't feel safe, they can't play well. So there's a lot about this in education when we talk about social emotional learning and making classrooms safe. A lot of this has to do with accessibility and diversity and inclusion and all that stuff, because we have a lot of different kinds of people out there.
Yeah. And that's such a beautiful thing. I wanted to point out one thing that you said back there, how, and I'm going to misquote you, but we can't really fault people for not knowing what they don't know.
Right.
Right. And I feel so. I'm primarily a jazz musician. I do all sorts of, at least when I was injured, I was playing all sorts of music, but I run a jam session at my school, and in the jazz culture, it's always baffled me how, and I'm starting to get it, but how people have such an aversion to getting up and just playing, and just seeing what happens. And that was within me too. Right. And I was thinking one day, maybe about a year ago, and I was like, why are we faulting people for what they don't know? Not knowing what they don't know. It's like, it's not their fault at all. Right. And yet we act as if like, because they don't know something that we know, that they didn't do their homework or don't deserve to be there. It's that whole meritocracy that I think that
they're not good enough.
It's present in all styles of music, but I've definitely observed it more on the jazz side of things. And going back to the educator standpoint, it's honoring where the students are, right? And then working with that. I think that's what honestly just makes me so excited about teaching, because that makes every student a new experience for me, right?
Every student is an adventure. Yeah, you don't know. You have no idea who this person is. That's why I really encourage teachers to do a comprehensive entrance interview. Get to know these people before you start teaching them. What are their favorite things to do? What music do they like? What are their challenges? Do they have any special needs? All of this stuff. Talk to the parents. Because where's their favorite place to be? You can use all that later.
Totally.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
So let me ask you a question.
Please.
What do you think would happen if in every lesson for every kid and every instrument, they were taught to improvise from the beginning? They were freed
output.
up from.
Oh my gosh. That just makes me so excited. I'm like jumping out of my chair here because it's so true, right?
Right.
It's if people like their creative output would just explode because, and not everything is going to be like professional grade, whatever that means, but that doesn't matter, right? Because it's just
right. Not everybody needs to be a professional.
Exactly.
But everybody can be an artist.
That's the motto for today. We're going to put that on a poster somewhere.
So can I read you a quote?
Please.
I've been seeing quotes on Facebook by this guy I never saw him before, Von Fleischbesser. Do you know who he is?
No, and please don't ask me to pronounce his last name.
No, don't. He's an Australian, I think, music educator. And he puts all kinds of, somebody's putting out his quotes. I don't know if it's him or somebody else, but this one really touched me. He said, "You just never know the impact you're having on a young person through being a music teacher. Every word we say or look that we give, the way we encourage or challenge, the environment we create and the support we give, it's such a humbling position. Every single moment counts." And that's why I say teaching is sacred. It's a sacred space, that one-on-one space with the teacher and the student. And so many of us just go through our days, well, I got to teach my 10 students today or whatever. And, scales, repertoire studies, and go through the whole thing. But wow, what happens when you stop and you really pay attention? Fascinating.
So awesome.
Yeah.
So I kind of want to transition here to your program with a transformational teacher. And I want to just open by reading a statistic that you had mentioned in a previous interview that you had done. And I just think it baffles. It's just astounding. You had said that 75 to 85% of professional musicians experience injury, and about 60% of students experience injury at some point, right? Am I correct on that?
Absolutely.
And so going into your transformational teacher program, just thinking about my experience, one of the reasons why, like I said, I decided to stick with the trumpet is because of that pedagogical aspect. And not only with that, but like when I got injured, my mentor, who I mentioned before, he showed me some of the phrases that I had heard my entire life as a trumpet player from well-meaning and well-educated professors and teachers throughout my entire life that were correct for some people, but not maybe for everybody. And so for all the trumpet players listening, things like use more air may work for some people.
What does that mean?
What does that mean? Right, exactly. And then that eventually led to my injury, that philosophy or whatever you want to call it. And so I'm just curious from a flute standpoint, are there certain phrases or cliches from a pedagogical standpoint that tend to be said a lot, but may not be as helpful for students?
So many. Just about everything that's taught about breathing. I mean, from support with your diaphragm to take as big a breath as you can and make it last as long as you possibly can. Like, sit. Oh, you can't even move. I have a whole workshop called Busting Breathing Mysteries and Myths. People don't even know what the diaphragm is, where it is, or how it works. You cannot support from the diaphragm. It doesn't do that. So, there's so many, and I hear from people all the time, and they drive me crazy. Stand up straight. This is one of the worst things you can tell anybody to do. And I wrote a series. I did a whole series of videos called "Your Mother Was Wrong." Why standing up straight is bad for you. So there's that. There's this whole thing of trying to do sit-ups while you're playing to strengthen your ab muscles for support. And there's pictures of people doing this with students. It's not the best way to teach.
Cool.
So I want to...
Yeah. Please.
No, there's a bunch of stuff. I want I know we're going to close in a minute. I want to share this quote. I heard this, this is from Desmond Tutu, and I started thinking about this stuff right before the pandemic hit. And this quote really changed my mind about a lot of things. And I had, because I've been teaching this injury prevention work for almost 25 years. And he said, this, of course, had to do with Africa, but he said, there comes a point where we need to stop just pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream and find out why they're falling in. So I was like, oh, I need to work with teachers. This is where the work needs to be done, because otherwise we're just pulling the same stuff. I'm still seeing kids in college who don't know anything about how to use their bodies. There's more and more teachers who are, especially at the college level in flute, that are getting better at dealing with it. There's more and more workshops that bring in yoga and Alexander technique and all kinds of somatic stuff. But there's still kids coming out of high school who are just a mess in the flute world.
And in the trumpet world. And it just occurred to me, maybe not all of my listeners may have not heard what body mapping is. And so briefly, would you just be able to go into like what body mapping is for musicians?
It developed out of the Alexander technique, which was a way of helping people achieve more ease in the way they move. But what Bill Conable, who was the cello teacher at Ohio State, and his ex-wife, Barbara Conable, both realized kind of at the same time was that it's the way we think about our body that controls how we move it. So Bill had this violin student came in whose bow arm couldn't bend at the elbow for the bow arm. And he asked her, he said, "Where's your elbow?" And she pointed up here. She couldn't move her elbow just fine when she was eating or driving, but when it came to the violin, she still thought her elbow was this close to the shoulder because she was so little when she started to play. She had made that map. Her brain had a map that the elbow was higher than it was. And he said, "Actually, it's down here." And she went, "Oh." And she could bow just fine.
Oh my gosh. Everybody listening on the audio should be watching on video at this point, because she just demonstrated really funny.
That's the story he tells, but it basically means that. So I'll give you another example. So if you're a pianist, and you're using your fingers all the time, and you look at your hand, it seems pretty clear. I'm holding out my hand and pointing to the bottoms of my fingers. It seems clear that that's the end of your fingers, that's where the joint is. But if you turn your hand over and you look at where the knuckles are, they're about a half inch lower than the top of my palm. So you move from the knuckles. Whoa. And they feel even easier to move.
Wow, that's so cool. I need to get your book.
Yeah. If you look, hang on a second. This is my buddy, Captain Bob, my skeleton. If you look at a model of the hand, you'll see how long the finger bones are.
Put it up a little higher. There you go.
You'll see how long the finger bones are, and that they go all the way down to the wrist. So like the heel of your hand, your finger bones move from all the way down there. This is a very different quality of movement. And in the flute, in the violin, a string instrument, you have to do a lot of spreading as well. Very different movement from trying to move at the top of your palm. It's a different quality and fluidity in movement. So we have maps like this about our entire body. And we have maps about like where the head is attached to the spine and how we move from there, or where the shoulder joint is and how it works, or everything. And we need to be clear about how the body works. We need to understand that. And what a body mapping teacher does is help you identify where your map needs a little help, where it's not serving you. So I did that with somebody today that took one of my lessons, that they didn't know where the head attached to the spine. They weren't able to move from there. They were trying to move from the back of the neck, which is where they thought that joint was. And that'll kill any musician because it tightens up your whole neck and your breathing and your jaw and everything. shoulder. Yes. Does that make sense?
It totally does. Yeah, that's something that my teachers post-injury have definitely worked with me on, is how I visualize or kinesthetically, I guess, experience my playing. And it's a game changer.
It's neuroscience. It's neuroscience.
Yeah.
We have maps in our brain of all kinds of things.
Totally.
So this is why all the books about body mapping there's one for violinists and a new one out for clarinetists and pianists, and David Vining's trombone book. If you haven't seen that, have you seen his stuff? He recovered from embouchure dystonia. Look him up, David Vining, Vining. Teaches in Arizona. Will. He's a kick-ass trombone player, but he had to stop playing because he had embouchure dystonia. So we have all these different, all these books out that are instrument specific. They go into the technique of that instrument. There's one for singers as well. Oboe. Yeah.
Cool. Well, Dr. Pearson, thank you so much for your time today. This has been so amazing for me. It's been like,
I have a feeling we could go on for another hour.
Yes, we could. This daylight's going to start dropping on us, and I'm going to get a big shadow on my face. But just a couple of questions before we end.
Yeah.
I love asking this next question because I get different responses. But let's say you could go back to you at the beginning of college, and you had the opportunity to take away that experience of first feeling that numbness and that 30-year journey that you went on. You could take it away or leave it there. Has this whole experience been worth it to you to leave it there, or would you change something?
Well, that's interesting, because even at the time, I was always interested in movement. I did some movement therapy, like with dancing. I was involved in psychology stuff. I was involved in the school I went to was a progressive education school where we didn't have exams or grades. We made up our own exams. So I already had the mindset that I could have used to deal with that. I know for a fact, when I look back at all the different things that I've done in my life, it wasn't just that, but I've had like three completely different careers, that all those things have made it possible for me to do what I am, to be who I am and do what I do. And I can point to the things in my Dalcroze training that helped me be who I am, and in my arts education training and the research I did on gifted kids and arts education and the after school program that I ran and all these different things that I did. And they all gave me tools and skills to make me better at what I do now. So the long answer is, it's a good thing to have done that, because I know so much more about how to help people. Mm-hmm. I bring a lot to the table when I work with someone. And my let's see, how many years of experience since I was 18? A lot. 50 and more years of experience. Well, 20 to 70 to 50 years, yeah.
There you go. That's a principle for life, everybody. What you're going through now is going to help you, to enable you to help other people in your future. That's just a principle. If you get nothing else from that, hang on to that principle.
Those people make really good teachers, because they've had to go through every little aspect of it, every tiny little thing, and figure it out. So,
absolutely. Yeah. And Dr. Pearson, Lee, if you were stopped by somebody who happened to have listened to this episode of Trust the Process, and they say, Dr. Pearson, I'm going through my own injury. What advice would you have for me, regardless of what instrument they play?
Two things. One is celebrate every little tiny bit of progress. We often get discouraged because we're not moving fast enough. We know what we want, and it's so big what we want, and we're not getting there. And, so we have to build in that. Like, even if we make one little tiny step forward, celebrate it. Get that joy in your body, because you need it to counteract all the negative stuff that you've had. And the other thing is I love the title of your podcast, Trust the Process, because, and there's a quote that it made me think of that Alexander's brother said, and this is known in the Alexander world. He said, stick to principle and it will all open up like a giant cauliflower. I love that. It's a great image. Giant. You just keep going when you know you're doing what's right and it feels right to you and you know you're on the right track. You know, that day, every day I'd wake up and think, is it going to be today? Am I going to finally feel better? There was one day when I was in Finland, I was standing in my little tiny kitchen. I lived in one room. All of a sudden, I could feel the floor. For the first time that I could remember. I could feel my feet grounded on the floor. It's those moments, you know, that you don't know when it's going to happen, but you'll have little things like that that'll sort of crystallize. Oh, something's happening. I don't know what it is or how it's happening, but something's happening.
Absolutely. And I can attest to that in my own experience. I've had a couple of those, you know, in the year and a half that I've been recovering. And, you know, you hang on to those. You hang on to those for dear life sometimes. Yeah.
And get a good teacher. Get somebody who's been through what you're going through because they know.
Definitely. Dr. Pearson, where can people find you online? Or
well, they can start with music-pain.com. I'm also on Facebook a lot. It's just my name, Lea Pearson. And if you flute or Massachusetts, you can find me through there. There's only a couple other Lea Pearsons on Facebook. They can send me an email to leapearson@mac.com, and I'll give you all these links. But I'd love to talk with anybody who feels like this resonates with them and wants to learn more about teaching, or they need help trying to connect their thoughts and their feelings and their music, so yeah.
And then if anybody's interested in joining your transformational teacher program, is that through Music-Pain or?
Yeah, they can just, there's a link on my website where they can send me an email about that.
Okay, perfect. Well, Dr. Pearson, thank you so much for your time today. And to everyone out there in podcast land, thank you so much for joining us for another episode, and keep trusting the process until next time.
Yes. Thank you so much, Clark, and thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Thank you to you.
Celebrate!
Celebrate. Thanks for listening today. I hope you got as much out of it as I did. To see a full bio for our guest today, see the show notes, or go to our website at trusttheprocesspodcast.com. Make sure you share this with a musician you care about who is going through injury, a music educator in your life, or anyone just trying to make it in life. If you have a suggestion for a guest or topic to cover, shoot me an email at trusttheprocesspodcast@gmail.com or send me a message on Facebook or Instagram. Before we go, I just want to give a heartfelt thank you and shout out to my team. Daniel Baldwin, who is my audio engineer, Kevin West, who does all music and sound effects for the show, Peyton Womack, our website developer, and my sister, Dana Lovell, who created the logo and promotional materials. We wouldn't have the show without them. So tune in next time for another episode of Trust the Process.